Hey guys! So last month I had recreated these Aleksandre snap jeans and I posted it and everyone loved it. I even got asked to make it a pattern, but I said I'll do one better yet. I'll just do from a full YouTube video tutorial of how to make the pattern, how to sew to make your own pair of snap jeans. I love these jeans so much. They're like my favorite pair right now in my closet. It just gave me so many opportunities to kind of restyle it and kind of fit within my wardrobe. This video is going to be a two-part series. This particular video is going to show you how to make your pattern, and the next one is going to show you how to actually sew it together, follow along with my steps. I am going to be using a particular pattern to work with. You're free to use any type of pattern you want to use. I'll just kind of give you some guidelines of what to look for when deciding to make your pattern. For me, I'm using my favorite pants pattern, which is actually the Mood Live Pants from Mood Society. It's actually a free pattern from mood.com. I'll link it below so you can actually access it. You don't have to use a particular pattern. I just love the way it fits for me. Also, the pin tuck detail in the front, which kind of works with the overall style as an original inspiration. So I am using this particular pattern, but you're free to use any pattern you want. When selecting your pattern, you definitely want something that's kind of fitted from the waist to hip. You don't want anything that's too tight throughout the leg because it's going to kind of not really make sense with the other layer of your short piece. But you want something that kind of fits at least from the waist to hip and then kind of more of like a straight leg or straight fit at the lower half. Again, the Mood Live Pants are my favorite because they have that pin tuck detail. They fit really well throughout. That's the one we're referring to and make my adjustments with to make my pattern. Supplies you need, your basic drafting supplies, some paper to draft with, your basic rulers, pencils, erasers, and so forth to really mark with, because we'll be rubbing off, kind of bouncing between using this original pattern and modifying it to our own. So we're going over the steps. You also want muslin to do a test fit because you might want to adjust a couple of things, especially when it comes to underlying short. So you want those particular materials to start off with, and then we'll get started and go through how to make your pattern. Alright, so we're going to be starting out with our pattern pieces. So I'm again using the Mood Live Pants, which is a free pattern off of mood.com, as my kind of sloper in a sense to work off of because I love the way this fits on me. It also has a featured front pin tuck, which is kind of resembles the original inspiration picture. So I'm using this particular pattern as my reference. So since this is an already created pattern, I kind of convert it back into a sloper in a sense. So I'm going to be tracing this off and then removing the seam allowance so I can work with it to make my manipulations on the pattern. From this pattern, the pieces that you would need would be the front and back of the pant, the front and back pant. You also will want to keep your fly facing, your fly extension or fly shield, and then of course your belt loops. The waistband, we're going to turn this into a contour waistband, so you can keep it for reference for length, but we're going to redraft the waistband to help fit the body better because it works better as a contour waistband opposed to a regular squared waistband. These are the pieces you'll need to kind of keep aside. These you won't have to really trace off. You can use the original pattern pieces to work with. And if you are drafting from an original sloper piece, you're just going to go ahead and redraft your fly facing and your fly shield, and also redraft your belt loops if you want to add belt loops to your pattern. But you mainly just need the front and back of your pants pieces. On this particular pattern piece of the front of the Live Pants, it does have a placement for the pocket. Since we're not redoing pockets, we're going to kind of ignore that. So basically, it has a little extension on the of the pocket piece that I pinned onto the actual pattern piece to create that side hip seam. Otherwise, it would be removed from the pattern piece. If you are using the Live Pants, make sure you kind of add that pocket piece back onto the pattern where you have a full front piece that's not removed from the shape right here. So you want to make sure you go ahead and readjust that back onto your pattern piece and then retrace the entire pattern onto your drafting paper. So now that my pattern pieces are traced, make sure you transfer all of your markings on the Live Pants. I transferred my place for my front pin tuck, and also the back has a back dart which I'm transferring to help keep the shape. And so now that I have the outline of the pattern traced, I'm going to go ahead and then redraw in my true seam, removing the seam allowance. That way I can go ahead and redraft the pieces that I need to accommodate the design. So I'm going to take my ruler, and my pattern has already included a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to go back through and kind of redraw in the true seam with my pencil and just kind of mark where the true seam would be, following along the guidelines of the outline of my paper, because I want to use that as my reference to go ahead and draft my pieces. So whatever seam allowance your pattern has, if it already has seam allowance added in, you want to remove that or take it away. If you're working from a sloper, you can just go directly into the next step. We go to alter the pattern. So I'm just going to go through and just draw in my seam allowance, remove my seam allowance to my true seam, and for me that's 1/2 inch. So I'm going to do this throughout the entire pattern, both my front and back, removing my seam allowance. And we'll go back at the end and add the seam allowance back in. Make sure from your pattern that you're adjusting that you already have all your main adjustments that you do to your pattern. This is a tried and true pattern for me, so I already have my length added in, my seat adjustment added into my pattern already, so I won't have to worry about that later. So any type of fitting issues you need to typically adjust to your pattern piece or to your sloper, make sure you do that ahead of time before we move forward into the next step. So now that we have our seams now trued off to use to draft our pattern, the first thing we need to do is go ahead and draft our undershort that goes underneath the short of the pants. So these are gonna be high waist or high cut, high shorts, and these can kind of be adjusted to how you want them to fit or look overall. Like mine is very high cut, like the original inspiration. The first thing I want to do is kind of use the outline of the pattern to draw in my short piece. So what I'm going to do first, I'm going to just mark in where my true crotch line is. I'm going to go ahead and square that off so I can know where my crotch measurement is going to be. Okay, and so to create a like short, which you'll again adjust and fit later, you want to then mark, I'm going to measure below the crotch level about 1.5 inches. I'm going to square straight down 1.5 inches and then mark. So from my crotch to my front, I'm going to square 1.5 inches straight down and then mark, and I'm going to square about 1.5 inches up on the side seam and then mark and reconnect my adjustment. I'm going to measure up 1.5 inches and then mark, and I'm going to reconnect my lines to make my short. So now my short is going to be this outline here. This was 1.5 inches and 1.5 inches. So this went up and then this went down from the short. You can do it higher, but I just want to do like a smaller number so I can kind of readjust it later. And then when I do my fit, I can kind of see how I want it to overall look. So I'm going to do the same thing on my back pant, coming from where the crotch line would be, right at the point of the rise, and I'm going to square 1.5 inches, and it's going to go up 1.5 inches from my crotch line. I'm going to reconnect everything, and then just retrace. So then once you have this, you're going to go ahead and then just retrace this off to make a duplicate. That way you can go ahead and fit this to track your pattern. So once traced off, I have 2 patterns that look like this to be my high short, and then I turned this into a muslin where I went ahead and fit this to kind of get an idea of how I want this to look. After a couple of modifications, this is kind of where you can kind of choose how you want it to look overall. If you don't want it to be as exposed or as high cut, you definitely don't have to. But for me, I want it to be extra, extra. So I had mine super high cut and then rearranged the pattern that way. And then some other modifications kind of like help me get the look that I wanted. But again, you can alter your short how you want it to look. If you don't want it too high cut, you can definitely make it lower. But in the end of the pattern, it looks something like this. After doing my muslin, I did 2 muslins to get a final pattern that looks like this to be my high short. I'm going to do this first before you go ahead and make your rest of your pants. You want to see how that overall fit and look before you make your actual pant pattern. So now I'm going to draw in the extension for our snap placement from the side seam of our pant. This all depends on the size of your snap or your button placement. So if you're doing like a 24 line, which is what I'm using, it can be a lot different from if you're using like a 20 size line of your button extension. So I'm using a 24 size line, which is about this size, about 5/8 of an inch total. So I'm going to kind of determine how much I went from the true side seam of my pant to where I want to extend out to the overlap on the pant. So I'm going to do probably about 1/2 inch from my original side seam to determine my true side extension. That way I have enough room on each side from the extension of my button placement. So from my seam, I'm going to go ahead and draw my 1/2 inch extension to determine my true seam finishing for my side of my pant. The side seam of my pant and draw in my 1/2 inch extension, which is going to be for my snap placement, which is actually where the original seam allowance was. But again, this can vary. If you have a much smaller button, like a 20 line, you may want to do like a 1/4 inch extension. It all depends on your placement. So this is not your seam allowance. This is just your extension for your snap placement. It can vary depending on the size of your button or your snap that you're using. So you want to do it on the outside of your seam, where your regular seam would be. You're going to do extension to extend out from this side. This is without the seam allowance included. So I'm using the seam as a guideline to redraft that side seam. And I'll go back in at the end and add in my true seam allowance after. True side. Okay, again, we're kind of doing this without seam allowance present. This is my true side seam of my pant. I have this. I'm going to go ahead and mark my snap placement where I want to first start my first place. But I want it right at the seam line because it's going to be a waistband there. So I'm just going to kind of mark about like a 1/4 inch, almost half, like a 1/4 inch down. I'm going to mark where my first snap is going to be. Then I'm going to determine how wide I want my placement to be of how many snaps I want to use. And I'm going to reference my original one to kind of see the difference. So my next one will be about here. So I can then use my sewing gauge to measure. I'm going to go here. I want to expand this. Over. It should be on my extended line. So I'm only doing one pant leg first, and then I'll just mirror it on my other pant leg and then just remark it. And I'm going to stop a little bit below the hem so it has some room there. This is going to be my snap placement. So I have about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I have 13. That's what I had the first time. I have 13 snap placements on the pant leg. If you want to go all the way down, you definitely can. I stop a little bit above to kind of give it more like a flare at the bottom. But again, that's your own choice of how you want to add, how many snaps you want to add in there to make your placement. And I have this, again, I'm going to put this on my one piece first, and I'll just mirror it and then transfer it to my other pattern piece. But I'm going to go ahead now that I have my extension in here. I'm going to also draw in my facing for my pant leg. So your pant leg is going to open, and it's going to kind of show itself when you have the snaps undone, if you choose to have them undone. So you don't want to have that same like finish. Also, kind of reinforce the snaps a little bit there. So I'm going to put a facing in to help it be kind of clean finish on the inside. You don't have to do the whole entire pant, but it's enough when you roll it over. It kind of shows the same side of the fabric or the material you're using. So there's no right or wrong way to do your facing. You just kind of just draw it in there to see about where you want this to roll back onto itself. So I do my upper portion a lot larger to kind of slim it back down into more of a squared piece below, because I'm only going to have the upper half of my pant open. So you kind of eyeball it in a sense. So I'm not having any type of direct measurement, but I'm going to kind of mark where I want my facing to go. So I do know that my pin tuck is here. That could be like your reference point. So you could use it as a guideline to mark where you want your facing to go. So I'm going to just kind of mark here, and then just want to kind of go back into a squared piece, and I can square this all the way down. Okay, this is going to be my area for my face, and that includes the extension where my snaps are going to be. The finished facing that I have, actually made this one a little bit larger. She could blend this out just a little bit more. I think she actually brought it to the front, so I'm going to bring this over just a little bit more. That way I have enough room, but you can kind of determine how much you want of your facing, depending on how open you want your snap pants to be. This would be the facing piece, and then I have squared down all the way down the rest of the pant leg, so when it opens, you only see the upper half. You're not really opening the lower half too much. So this one's about 3 inches. And then I just did it from the marking from the front and just kind of blot it back into here. And this is the facing area. So you want to go ahead and trace that off, and that would be your facing piece. So now we need to go ahead and draw in our waistband, but I'm doing a contour waistband. If you want to keep the regular waistband that came with the pattern, that's fine. For me, if it's better if it's a contour waistband, so I'm going to go ahead and draw that in. To do that, I just like to just use the tracing of the actual waistline of my pant pattern and then square it up to fit the amount. So my waistband pattern, I want it to be about 1.5 inches total. So we're going to go ahead and overlay a piece over it and then retrace my waistline. So I'm going to put this down and then draw in my grain here. And then use my ruler to go ahead and then just trace off the original waistline from the underside pattern. That includes where you did your extension for your snaps. And then from there, I'm going to go ahead and draw the depth of my waistband, which is going to be 1.5 inches, following the waistline. So for the front of my waistband, I'm going to be doing 2. One's going to be include the extension for my fly shield. So make sure I include that as well. So I know my fly shield, I'm going to measure that out. And that's going to be, it is about 1.75 inches less the seam allowance. So I'm going to go ahead and draw that in. So 1.75 inches less the seam allowance. So 1.25 inches and square that out. This is going to be my right waistband. I'll just have to flip it. So this is my center front, and this is the extension for my fly extension. And then I'm going to copy this and then do another waistband where it just stops at the center front plus my seam allowance. For the back, I'm going to do the same thing. My back has a dart. I need to incorporate that. So I'm going to draw in this mark so I can see my waistline. And that includes the extension for my snaps. And then I'm going to go ahead and trace that. And that's going to be 1.5 inches. So this is where the darts are, so I need to be able to close that. I'm just going to extend that dart up, and then I would just close this. And then re-blend my lines. And use my wheels to recurve that. And the back is going to be unfold. Another option you can do, if you take the waistband of the original pattern and you can just measure against your true waistline and then slash and close to get a finished waistline, which I did in the first one. So I just closed the pattern pieces and then just recurve my pieces to kind of adjust my waistband. So you can do either method to kind of get your waistband, up to you to finalize that. And now we have all of our pieces kind of drafted. We're going to go ahead and just true all of our seams. So you want to get your curve ruler, your hip curve ruler, and just readjust everything. For me, because I did adjust my seat, I had to kind of just reblend that. And once you have that, you're going to go back through and add your seam allowance on your entire pattern. And then we're good to go into the next step, which is to actually sew our pattern pieces. I do recommend doing muslin first, but we are going to then go ahead and sew this together and do the next step. This is just a quick clip of me trying on my muslin mock-up of my pants. I have my shorts in, and I use safety pins to kind of pin the sides together to check the overall fit of everything. I did put the zipper in just to make sure everything looks the way I want it to look, and make sure I can kind of figure out how I want to go ahead and sew it together. But you do want to do a quick muslin to make sure everything looks the way you want it to look and fit properly. And then I want to go into part 2 next of how to actually sew it together. But definitely recommend to do a quick muslin before you cut and sew into your actual fashion fabric.